"Her family has nothing to offer this house," the groom's mother said, loud enough for the front 3 pews to hear, and I watched my brother's hand close around the head of his cane as though he meant to break it in half. I am not a man given to remembering weddings. I have sat through dozens, bored past feeling, counting the minutes until the wine was poured. But I will remember this one until I am put in the ground myself, because I watched my brother, Alaric Vane, the 9th Duke of Greywick, a man the whole of England called cold and called cruel and called, behind cupped hands, the Ember Duke for the banked fire everyone swore lived under his ice, rise from the last pew of St. Aldwyn's, and walk down the aisle of another man's wedding to claim a bride who was not his. Let me tell it properly from the beginning, because he would want it told properly. He was always exact. It was the thing that made him feared in ballrooms and boardrooms alike, and it was the thing, I have come to understand, that made him love her before he ever let himself call it love. Her name was Lynette Ashworth. I did not know her on that morning, not her face, not her voice, though I would come to know both so well that I cannot now separate her laugh from my own family's laughter, cannot think of a quiet evening without hearing her correcting my Latin over the rim of a teacup. On that morning she was a stranger to me, a slight woman in ivory silk standing at the altar rail of St. Aldwyn's, with her spine so straight it looked as though it hurt her to hold it, while the man she was to marry stood beside her and would not meet her eyes. His name was Mr. Julian Farrow, and he was, by every account I ever heard, an unremarkable man elevated briefly by the accident of loving a remarkable woman, and made small again the instant his family decided that loving her cost too much. I had heard before that morning small fragments of who Lynette Ashworth was, the way one hears of any woman about to marry into a family one is loosely acquainted with. A clergyman's daughter from a parish 2 counties north, motherless since girlhood, raised on her father's shelves rather than his sermons. Clever, people said, in the careful tone London reserves for a compliment it does not quite intend as one. Too clever, some added, with the particular emphasis that turns a virtue into a warning. I had thought little of it. London manufactures a dozen such warnings a season and discards them all by autumn. The whispering had started before the vows. I noticed it the way one notices weather changing, a chill moving through a room of silk and candle smoke, mothers leaning together behind fans, a low current of words too soft to catch but unmistakable in shape. Something was wrong. Something was going to happen. I had been in enough rooms with my brother to know the particular quality of a silence before a storm, and this was that silence, thickening pew by pew. Miss Ashworth did not seem to hear it, or she had trained herself past hearing it, which I would later learn was nearer the truth. She stood with her chin lifted, and her gloved hands folded, and her eyes on the vicar as though the entire cathedral might have been empty of everyone but the 2 people meant to be married in it. It was the groom's mother, Lady Farrow, who broke first. She rose from the front pew, actually rose, mid-ceremony, silk rustling like a struck match, and said the words that would follow this family for the rest of their days. Her family has nothing to offer this house. I will not stand by and watch my son shackle himself to a woman with no fortune and no name worth the ink it would take to write it in our book. The cathedral did not gasp so much as inhale, all at once, 300 throats catching the same breath. I felt my own brother go rigid beside me, though I did not yet understand why a stranger's cruelty should matter to him more than idle scandal mattered to anyone. Mr. Farrow, and here is the particular shame of it, the detail I have never been able to forgive him even these years later, did not defend her. He looked at his mother, and he looked at the woman he had asked to marry him, and he said, "Lynette, I am sorry," in a voice that made it clear he was not sorry enough to lose his inheritance over her. He stepped back from the altar rail. He actually stepped back, as though she were a fire he had realized too late might burn him, and he left her standing there alone in her ivory silk with the vicar's prayer book still open to the vows neither of them would finish speaking, and 300 of London's most eager tongues already composing the story they would tell over supper. I have wondered since what that moment must have felt like from inside it, to stand in a cathedral in your wedding silk, having rehearsed vows you meant with your whole heart, and watch the man who asked for them decide, in the space of a single sentence from his mother, that your heart was not worth the price of his inheritance. I have a sister of my own, and I could not even now bear to imagine her in Linnet's place. But I would learn, in the weeks that followed, that Linnet Ashworth had survived worse mornings than this one, quietly, alone, without the mercy of an audience to at least witness the unfairness of it. And that survival, practiced so long in private, was precisely what let her stand there now with her spine unbent, refusing to give Lady Farrow the satisfaction of watching her break. I have seen my brother angry. I grew up beside him through a father who ruled Greywick with a closed fist and a colder heart, and I know the shape of Alaric's fury, the stillness of it, how it does not shout but settles, like frost taking a window pane by inches. Our father had taught us both, in his own harsh fashion, that a vain man did not raise his voice. He simply removed what he intended to remove, quietly and completely, and let the silence afterward do the explaining. Alaric had learned that lesson better than I had, and had spent the better part of his life mistaken for a man without feeling because he had never once let feeling show itself in the ordinary forgivable ways. A raised word, a slammed door, a temper spent and done. He simply went still, and stayed still, until whatever had wronged him was answered. I saw that stillness come over him now, watching a woman he had never been introduced to stand alone before a congregation that was already beginning, in small ugly murmurs, to enjoy her ruin. But beneath the fury, I saw something I did not expect, something I would not understand fully until later that week, when he finally told me the truth he had been carrying alone for the better part of 2 years. I saw recognition. My brother looked at Linnet Ashworth standing abandoned at that altar rail, the way a man looks at a face he has already memorized from a portrait, though he had never, by his own account, laid eyes upon her before that morning. He rose. I want to be honest and say that for one terrible instant I thought he meant only to leave, to spare himself the indignity of witnessing a scene, because that would have been like him. Alaric fled discomfort the way other men fled fire. But he did not move toward the doors. He moved toward the aisle. He walked the length of that cathedral in the particular silence that only he could command, boots striking stone, and I have never in my life heard a room go so entirely still so fast. Even Lady Farrow, mid-triumph, closed her mouth. Even the vicar, who surely had never once in 30 years of service been required to improvise, set down his book. My brother stopped beside Linnet Ashworth. He did not touch her. He was careful, even then, even in the heat of whatever had moved him to cross that aisle, he was careful with her, as though she were something he had waited a long time to be allowed near, and did not intend to spoil the waiting with a careless hand. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice carried to the back pews without his raising it at all, "I believe you were about to be married. I would be honored if you would consider finishing the ceremony with a groom who understands what he is being given." I watched her study him, not with the giddy relief a lesser woman might have shown at rescue, but with the careful, assessing look of someone who had been disappointed by confident men before, and did not intend to trade one humiliation for another simply because the second one arrived better dressed and with a grander title. It was, I would come to learn, entirely characteristic of her. She did not accept things on the strength of how they were offered. She examined them first, the way she examined a difficult sentence in a dead language, turning it in the light until she was satisfied she had understood every part of its meaning. I have turned that sentence over in my memory 100 times since, because it was so entirely unlike him, and so entirely, perfectly like the man I knew he could be beneath 30 years of armor. He did not say her name to shame the Pharaohs, though it did. He did not say it for the pleasure of scandal, though it produced one that would keep London's drawing rooms occupied for a month. He said it because he had, I would learn, been waiting to say it for a very long time, and a jilted bride at an altar rail was simply the first moment fate had ever handed him permission. To understand what happened next, you must understand what I did not yet know, which is that my brother had loved Lynette Ashworth's mind for 2 years before he ever loved her face. It began, as he told it to me later, with letters, not love letters, nothing so simple. Greywick held, among its inherited debts and inherited grudges, a great library that our grandfather had assembled, and none of us had troubled to read, full of correspondence and manuscripts in French, in Italian, in the old crabbed Latin of dead clergymen, much of it illegible to any man in the family, including my brother, who for all his coldness was not stupid, only untrained in tongues he had never needed to learn. He had, on the advice of a solicitor, sent a bundle of the family's oldest and most tangled correspondence, estate boundaries disputed 2 centuries past, a marriage contract written half in church Latin and half in a dialect no one in London could place, to a translator recommended quietly, almost apologetically, as unconventional. A woman, self-taught. The daughter of a country parson with no money and no university behind her, who had somehow, through sheer devouring hunger for words, taught herself 7 languages from her father's shelf of donated books, and the kindness of a bishop who had once let her copy his correspondence for practice. She had solved, within a fortnight, a dispute that 2 generations of Greywick solicitors had failed to untangle in 30 years. She had done it, moreover, in a manner that revealed she had not merely translated the words, but understood the law beneath them, appending to her fair copy a short, unasked-for note observing that one clause had likely been mistranslated deliberately, a century before, by a solicitor eager to please a Greywick who wanted a particular boundary to read a particular way. My brother told me that, when he read that note, alone in his study with the fire gone low, he had laughed, not at the impertinence of a translator correcting a duke's own family history, but at the sheer nerve of a woman who had clearly decided that being right mattered more than being deferential, and had simply trusted him to prefer it that way. My brother did not meet her. He corresponded with her instead, through her father's name at first, and then, when the fiction grew tedious to maintain, through hers directly, because she had simply written back one day, plainly, that she saw no reason to hide behind her father's signature for work her father had not done. Alaric told me he laughed aloud reading that line, alone in his study, which was a thing I had not heard him do in years. The correspondence continued long after the original commission was finished. He invented reasons, a Florentine account book, a French treatise on husbandry, a bundle of his own grandmother's letters written half in a code of endearments and abbreviations that took Lynette Ashworth 3 weeks, and by her own admission, considerable delight to break. He kept every one of her replies. I found them afterward, tied in ribbon in his desk, page after page of a hand grown gradually less formal, gradually more her own, sharp, funny, entirely unafraid of a duke's opinion, correcting his Latin without apology and teasing him, gently, for a family motto he had never once questioned the translation of. I have read a handful of those letters myself, in the years since, with both their blessing, and I will share one exchange because I think it explains more than any account of mine could. My brother had written, in his 8th letter, complaining, in the dry, understated way he complains about everything, that a certain steward on the Greywick estate had proven incompetent, and that he did not know what to do with a man who meant well but accomplished nothing. Lynette wrote back, "You ask what to do with a man who means well but accomplishes nothing. I would ask first whether you have told him plainly what accomplishing something would look like, or whether you have simply grown tired of watching him fail at a task you never troubled to describe. Meaning well is not nothing, sir, but it is not instruction either. I find that most men mistake the second for a want of the first. My brother told me he had read that paragraph perhaps a dozen times the evening it arrived, because no one, not his father, not his tutors, not a single person in 30 years of being deferred to, had ever corrected him so plainly and so kindly in the same breath. He rewrote his instructions to the steward the very next morning. The man is still in service at Greywick to this day, and does his work well. It was around the 20th letter, my brother told me, that he began signing them yours instead of merely A. Greywick, and around the 30th that he began to dread the fortnight between her replies, the way another man might dread the absence of food or fire. He fell in love with her on paper before he ever knew what she looked like, and when at last he learned, through idle mention at a dinner, he attended only because he could not decently refuse it, that Miss Linnet Ashworth of the clever letters was engaged to be married to Mr. Julian Farrow. He told me he had felt something in his chest go out like a snuffed candle, and had said nothing, because what right did a duke who had never once signed his own true name to his letters have to object? That was the detail that undid me most when he finally confessed it. He had written to her for 2 years under a partial fiction, as A. Greywick, never as the Duke, because in the beginning it had been simple caution, and by the end it had become something more fragile, a fear that if she knew who he was, she would write to the title and not to the man, the way every woman in London wrote to the title and not the man. He had wanted, at least once in his life, to be loved, or at minimum respected, for something other than the accident of his birth. And Linnet Ashworth, without ever knowing it, had given him exactly that, letter after letter, for 2 years, never once knowing she was corresponding with the most feared duke in England. I asked him once why he had never simply called upon her, once the correspondence had become so dear to him. Why a man who commanded armies of tenants and sat in Parliament, and had never in his life been accused of timidity, should be too afraid to knock on a country parson's door. He told me that he had ridden as far as the end of her village lane on 3 separate occasions, and turned back each time, because he could not bear the thought of watching her face change the moment she learned his name. That particular shuddering he had seen in 100 drawing-rooms, the instant a woman stopped seeing a man and started seeing a title to be won. He said he would rather have kept the letters forever, anonymous and imperfect, than risk losing the one correspondent in England who had never once curtsied to him on paper. It was, I think, the loneliest thing he ever told me, and it explained more of my brother's coldness toward the rest of society than 30 years of watching him had managed to teach me. He was not cold because he felt nothing. He was cold because he had learned, early and thoroughly, that warmth offered plainly to the world was warmth the world would use against him, flattered, courted, and angled for his fortune rather than met honestly in return. Linnet Ashworth, hiding nothing behind a country parsonage and a shelf of borrowed books, had simply never learned to angle for anything at all, and it was that plainness, more than any beauty or any fortune, that had undone him utterly. So when he stood beside her at that altar rail and said her name in front of 300 witnesses, he was not a stranger making an impulsive claim on a beautiful stranger. He was a man who had loved her mind first, loved her wit second, and was only now, for the first time, allowed to love her face, and terrified, beneath all that terrible stillness, that she would look at him and see only the title that had jilted men far better than Julian Farrow had reason to fear. Linnet turned to him at the altar rail with an expression I will attempt, though I know I will fail, to describe. There was shock in it, certainly. A woman does not stand abandoned before God and society and then have a duke cross a cathedral to claim her without some shock. But beneath the shock there was a terrible, guarded hope, the kind I imagine a person allows themselves only once or twice in a lifetime, because to hope and be wrong again, in front of the same crowd in the same hour, might be more than a person could bear twice in one morning. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice, though quiet, did not shake. I would learn that almost nothing shook Linnet Ashworth's voice, not humiliation, not grief, not a congregation's judgment. "I do not know you." "You do," he said. You have known me for 2 years. You simply did not know my name." I watched understanding move across her face like light crossing water, slow, then all at once. Her lips parted. Her gloved hand rose halfway to her mouth and stopped, as though she had caught herself before the gesture could finish. "A Greywick," she whispered. "Alaric," he said, "I am sorry. I should have told you from the first letter. I told myself it was prudence. It was cowardice." I have never, before or since, heard my brother call himself a coward aloud, least of all before witnesses, least of all before Lady Farrow, who stood frozen in the front pew with her mouth still shaped around the cruelty. She had not finished speaking when the Duke of Greywick crossed her son's wedding to answer it. Lynette Ashworth looked at him for a long moment, long enough that somewhere behind us a woman's fan stilled entirely, long enough that I heard the vicar's breath catch. And then she said the thing that I believe, more than any vow either of them spoke afterward, was the true marriage of the morning. "You corrected nothing I wrote to you. Not once in 2 years did you tell me a woman ought not to have opinions on husbandry or scripture or the failings of French grammar. I thought you the only man in England who did not think my mind was a fault to be managed." "It was never a fault," my brother said. "It was the finest thing I had ever encountered, and I have inherited castles." Someone in the pews laughed, a startled, helpless bark of a laugh, quickly smothered, and I confess it was very nearly me. But I am getting ahead of the ceremony, and my brother would want the account exact, so let me return to what happened next, because the story does not end with a pretty confession. It ends with a reckoning, and Lynette Ashworth, whatever else she was not a woman who let a reckoning pass her by unspoken. She turned from my brother to Lady Farrow, and something in her bearing changed, not softened, but sharpened, the way a blade catches light differently when it is finally drawn. "You said my family has nothing to offer this house," she said, and her voice, though still quiet, reached every pew, because a cathedral built for sermons carries a steady voice better than a shout. "You are correct that we have no fortune. My father left me his library and his debts in equal measure, and I have spent 4 years paying the second with the money I earned putting the first to use. But you are wrong that we have nothing to offer. I have translated treaties that kept 2 counties from suing each other into ruin. I have untangled contracts your own solicitors could not read. I have corresponded for 2 years with a man whose name I did not know, and in all that time he never once suggested that my worth was measured in what my family could hand over on a ledger. I did not lack fortune this morning, Lady Farrow. Your son lacked the courage to say so before I stood in ivory silk and let 300 people watch him decide I was not worth defending. I do not know that I have ever, in any drawing room or parliament chamber, heard a silence so complete as the one that followed. Lady Farrow's face went the color of the altar cloth. Her son, I will grant him this much, it was the single moment of the morning he did anything correctly, did not attempt to speak. Lynette was not finished. I have thought since that she had likely carried these words for months, perhaps years, turning them over in private the way she turned over a difficult translation, waiting for a moment honest enough to deserve them. I have been called unfortunate my whole life, Lady Farrow, by women very like you. Unfortunate in my birth. Unfortunate in my lack of a mother to guide me properly. Unfortunate that I read too much and curtsied too little and never learned to make myself agreeably stupid in a drawing room. I stopped believing I was unfortunate the day I discovered that the very faults you named were the ones that kept a roof over my father's head after his health failed, and paid for the physician who eased his final months, and have never once, in 4 years, left me dependent on a single soul's charity. I do not know what fortune you imagine my family lacks. We have never lacked for dignity, which is a good deal more than I can say for this morning's conduct in your family's name. My brother beside her said nothing at all. He did not need to. I understood, watching him, that this was precisely why he loved her, and why he had loved her before he had ever seen her face, because she did not need a duke to fight her battles for her. She had simply been waiting all this time for someone who would not ask her to be smaller than she was. The vicar, God bless the man, found his composure before anyone else did. "Your Grace," he said, the ceremony that was to be performed this morning cannot, of course, proceed as arranged." "No," my brother agreed. "It cannot." "I would ask, then, whether your Grace intends." "I intend to marry her," my brother said, "if she will have me, and I intend to be asked to earn that, not assume it, because Miss Ashworth has spent her whole life being underestimated by men who assumed a great deal and earned nothing." He turned to her fully then, and for the first time since he had crossed the aisle, I saw the stillness crack, not into anger, but into something far more unguarded, something I do not believe more than a handful of people alive had ever been permitted to see on my brother's face. "I am not asking you to accept a title in place of a groom who abandoned you. I am asking you to consider a man who has read every letter you ever sent him more times than he would like to admit, and who has been in love with your mind since the second one, and who would very much like the chance, if you will allow it, to be in love with the rest of you as well, properly, slowly, however long you require." Lynette Ashworth looked at him, and here I must confess I have never fully found the words for what passed over her face, though I have tried many times since to describe it to my own wife, who insists I am hopeless at describing anything so delicate as an expression. It was not simple joy. It was something steadier than joy, something that looked almost like relief, as though a weight she had carried since childhood, the weight of being clever in a world that preferred women decorative, had finally been set down by someone strong enough to take it from her without ever once making her feel she had needed the help. "I have spent my whole life being told my mind was too much for the men who might have wanted the rest of me," she said. "I do not know how to trust a man who says the opposite." "Then do not trust me yet," my brother said. "Trust the 2 years of letters instead. I have not changed a single word of what I believe in them since I signed the last one. Ask me anything you asked A. Greywick, and I will answer as he would have, because he was never anyone but me." It was, I think, the exactness of that offer that moved her. Not a grand declaration, not poetry, but a duke offering to be cross-examined against 2 years of his own correspondence, in front of a full cathedral, because he understood that a woman who had built her whole life on the discipline of precise translation would trust nothing so much as consistency proven under scrutiny. I should say, too, that I do not believe my brother made that offer lightly or with any confidence of the outcome. I stood close enough to see his hands, and they were not steady. This was a man who had negotiated with foreign ministers and faced down creditors twice his age without so much as a raised pulse. And here he stood in front of 300 witnesses with his hands trembling slightly at his sides, because the only judgment he had ever truly feared was the one about to be delivered by a woman in borrowed silence at an altar rail that was not, technically, his to stand at. She asked him one question, right there at the altar rail, quiet enough that only those of us in the first few pews caught it. "In your 14th letter, you asked whether I believed a marriage could exist between equals when the law recognized only one of the two as a full person before it. What did you mean by that, truly?" My brother did not hesitate. "I meant that I did not want a wife who obeyed me. I meant that if I ever married, I wanted a woman who would argue with me in Latin and win, and that the law's opinion of the matter could go hang, because in my own house I intended to build something the law had not yet imagined." Lynette Ashworth's composure, which had not broken under Lady Pharaoh's cruelty, which had not broken under the vicar's confusion, which had not broken under 300 pairs of judging eyes, broke then, not into tears, though there were tears, but into a laugh, bright and astonished and entirely without artifice. The laugh of a woman who has just discovered that the thing she wanted most in the world had apparently been writing to her for 2 years under an assumed name, and she had been too busy admiring his mind to notice. He had a title attached to it. "You absolute," she began, and then seemed to remember where she was and who was watching, and pressed her gloved hand briefly to her mouth to contain the rest of the sentence, though I saw my brother's mouth curve, just slightly, at whatever word she had swallowed. "Say it," he told her. "I have been called worse by better men, and I would rather hear it from you than flattery from anyone else in this cathedral." "You absolute coward," she said, but she was smiling now, fully, unguardedly, in a way I suspect very few people in that congregation had ever seen a jilted bride smile within the hour of her own abandonment. 2 years, and you never once signed your name. I am prepared to spend considerably longer than 2 years making that particular cowardice up to you," he said, "if you will permit it." She looked past him then to the vicar, who was watching the two of them with the particular helpless expression of a man whose morning had gone entirely off the order of service he had prepared. "Can you marry us?" she asked. "Or must there be banns read again, papers signed, a waiting period observed?" "Miss Ashworth already has a license," the vicar said faintly. "It was drawn for this morning. It does not, I believe, specify the groom's given name so much as the groom's presence and consent, provided the lady also consents, and provided," he glanced, a little wildly toward Lady Farrow, who had not moved from where she stood, frozen in the front pew, "provided the original groom does not object." Every eye in the cathedral turned to Julian Farrow. He had gone very pale. He looked between his mother, whose fury had curdled into something closer to fear now that she understood exactly whose displeasure she had earned, and the woman he had left standing alone not 10 minutes before, and the Duke of Greywick, whose reputation for cold ruthlessness in matters of business was, I happen to know, entirely deserved and not confined to business. He started, and then seemed to find, at last, some remnant of the man Linnet Ashworth must once have seen something worth loving in, because he straightened his shoulders and said quietly, "No, I have no objection. I forfeited any right to one the moment I stepped back from her." He looked at Linnet directly, for what I suspect was the first time all morning. "I am sorry, Linnet, truly. You deserved a man who would have said what he just said, and I let my mother's opinion matter more than my own. I hope you will be far happier than I had the courage to make you." It was not a grand redemption. I do not offer it as one, but it was honest, and I have found that honesty, however late, is worth something even when it arrives after the damage is already done. Lady Farrow, for her part, said nothing at all, which was, I think, the wisest thing she did that entire morning. The vicar cleared his throat, looked down at the license in his trembling hands, looked up at my brother and said, in the tone of a man who has decided that some mornings simply must be met with whatever grace can be improvised, "Your Grace, Miss Ashworth, if you are both willing and both consenting and no lawful objection stands." Another darting glance toward the Farrows, who offered none. "Then I believe we may proceed." They were married within the hour in the same cathedral, before the same 300 witnesses who had come that morning, expecting an entirely different bride, to leave on an entirely different man's arm. I stood as my brother's witness, as was my right and my honor, and I watched Linnet Ashworth become Linnet Vane, Duchess of Greywick, in a voice that did not shake once through the whole of her vows, though I saw her hand tremble just slightly, when my brother slid the ring onto her finger, not from fear, I think, but from the sheer velocity of a morning that had asked her to survive abandonment and accept devotion within the space of a single hour. When the vicar at last pronounced them married, my brother did not kiss her immediately, as I half expected. He raised her hand instead, the one now wearing the Greywick ring, a heavy old band of dark gold that had belonged to our grandmother, the same grandmother whose coded letters Linnet had broken for sport, and he pressed his lips to her knuckles with a reverence I had genuinely never once seen him show anything, not power, not land, not the family name he had spent his whole life defending. "I have been in love with you since your 3rd letter," he said, quietly enough that I believe he meant it only for her, though the whole front pew heard it regardless, when you told me that a man who cannot admit an error in translation has no business governing a household, let alone a county. I have tried to admit my errors ever since. I hope you will let me go on admitting them for the rest of my life. Only if you let me correct them, Lynette said. I would have it no other way, my brother said, and then, at last, he kissed her carefully, gently, the way he had touched nothing else all morning, as though she were the one fragile and precious thing in a world he had otherwise learned to hold at a cold remove. And the cathedral, which had gone silent for a cruelty an hour before, erupted instead into something that sounded, astonishingly, like genuine cheering. I will tell you what became of them, because I think Alaric would want the account finished properly, the way he wanted every account finished. Lady Farrow found herself, within the season, considerably less welcome in the drawing-room she had once ruled by reputation alone, for society will forgive a great many sins, but rarely forgives being made to watch a duke correct one in public. There is a particular cruelty London reserves for those who are caught being cruel themselves, and Lady Farrow discovered it that autumn, uninvited from 3 houses in a fortnight. Her cutting remarks suddenly met with the same cold indifference she had once dispensed so freely to others. Julian Farrow left London for a time, and when he returned, I am told, he was a quieter man, which I choose to believe was an improvement. He married, eventually, a woman of good fortune and unremarkable conversation, and I understand they are content, in the muted way of people who have settled for comfort over the far harder work of courage. My own wife, Eleanor, was not present that morning. She was confined at home, expecting our second child, and has never forgiven me for describing the scene to her second hand, rather than allowing her to witness it herself. She and Lynette became fast friends within the month, bonded, I think, by a shared and immediate impatience with anyone who mistook a quiet woman for a foolish one. It is Eleanor who first pointed out to me, watching the two of them across a drawing-room some months after the wedding, that Lynette had a way of listening to my brother, really listening, weighing each word before she answered it, that no one else in his life had ever thought to offer him, because everyone else had always been too busy either fearing him or flattering him to actually hear him. Lynette, my sister now, though I have never once managed to think of her as anything so ordinary as a sister-in-law, for she has felt from the first week like something closer to family chosen rather than family given, did not set aside her work when she took the title. She continued it from the vast, dust-choked library at Greywick, the very room where 2 years of letters between A. Greywick and a country parson's clever daughter had first been written, and within a year she had made that library the finest private collection of translated correspondence in England, sought after by scholars who would once never have thought to write to a woman for anything at all. My brother, the man half of London still called cold, still called the Ember Duke as though the name were half a warning, spent every evening I ever witnessed at Greywick after their marriage sitting across from his wife with a book in his own lap purely, so he might be near enough to ask her, every quarter hour or so, what some particular turn of phrase truly meant, though I came to suspect, watching him watch her work, that he had usually understood it perfectly well already, and simply wanted the reason to hear her voice. I visited Greywick often enough in that first year to see the smaller proofs of it, the ones no cathedral full of witnesses ever saw. I saw him learn, without complaint, to sit through her long silences while she worked, silences that would once have made him restless, until he came to treasure them instead, because he said watching her frown over a difficult phrase was the nearest thing he had ever seen to watching a person pray. I saw her learn, in turn, to accept his fussing over small things, an extra shawl against a draught, a lamp moved nearer her desk without being asked, not as the condescension she had spent her whole life bracing against, but as the plain, unremarkable language of a man who had simply never before had anyone to fuss over. I saw them argue once, quite fiercely, over the correct rendering of a single Italian word, and I saw the argument end not in either of them yielding, but in both of them laughing, because neither had ever before been permitted to disagree with a spouse and remain entirely, comfortably loved regardless of who was right. He gave her, that first Christmas, not jewels, though he could have given her diamonds enough to ransom a small country, but a standing arrangement with 3 separate university libraries in England and 1 in Edinburgh, granting her access to manuscripts no woman had ever before been permitted to touch unescorted. She wept over that gift in a way she had not wept even at the altar, and told him it was the first present anyone had ever given her that assumed she would still be exactly who she was in 20 years' time, rather than someone gentled and simplified by marriage into a person easier to manage. I think of that morning at St. Aldwyn's often, the cruelty spoken aloud before a congregation that expected only a wedding, the silence that followed it, and my brother rising from the last pew to walk the length of an aisle that was not his to walk, because he had loved a woman's mind for 2 years before he ever dared love the rest of her, and he was not, in the end, willing to let a single unworthy morning decide what the 2 of them were owed. He told me once long after that he had almost not gone that day, that he had accepted the invitation only out of some obscure sense of obligation to a family whose lands bordered his own, never dreaming the bride at the altar would be the very woman whose letters he had read and reread until the pages softened at the folds. He said that, when he saw her standing alone in that ivory silk, abandoned by a man who did not deserve the privilege of her correspondence, he understood, all at once and entirely, that he had spent 2 years being a coward about the one thing in his life he had never once been afraid to fight for. I decided, he told me, that I would rather be known forever as the Duke who claimed another man's bride at the altar than live 1 more year as the coward who signed his letters with someone else's courage. Lynette, when I repeated this to her, only smiled and said that she had decided something rather similar the moment she recognized his handwriting in a stranger's voice, that she would rather be scandal for 1 honest morning than safety for a lifetime of being underestimated. They are, to this day, the same 2 people who stood together at that altar rail, he still exacting, still feared by men who mistake his stillness for cruelty and never trouble to look closer. She still sharper than any room she enters, still utterly unwilling to make herself smaller for anyone's comfort. But I have never seen 2 people listen to each other so completely, nor watched devotion made so plain in so many small hours. A hand offered without being asked, a translation corrected without ever once being unkind, a whole library rebuilt around a woman that half of London once swore had nothing at all to offer. They had everything to offer each other. It only took a wedding gone wrong, and a duke brave enough at last to sign his own name, for the rest of the world to finally see it too.